In one mission, elite troops landed in a hostile country and never even reached their target. In another, a rescue operation 4,000 kilometers from home was over in 90 minutes. There was a time when impossible missions failed more than they succeeded, not because the soldiers weren't good enough, because the system sending them didn't exist yet. What we now call special operations, the doctrine, the command structure, the intelligence integration, the joint training, none of it was built in advance. It was built in the wreckage. Each failure produced a lesson. Each lesson produced a reform. Each reform was tested in the next operation, and if that operation failed too, the lesson went back into the system and the process started again. This is that process. 6 operations across 5 decades, not a list of heroic missions, a record of how modern warfare learned what it didn't know. If you've never seen this channel before, this is what we do. We take the operations that changed how countries fight, and we show you exactly what happened and why. Subscribe if that's what you're here for. In the autumn of 1944, Allied commanders believed the war in Europe could be ended by Christmas. The logic was not unreasonable. Germany was retreating on multiple fronts. The momentum from Normandy had not fully stopped. What was missing was a breakthrough, one concentrated strike that could cross the Rhine and carry the Allies into Germany's industrial heartland before winter. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a plan. It was called Operation Market Garden. 35,000 paratroopers would drop across a 60-mile corridor in German-occupied Holland, seizing a sequence of bridges in a single concentrated blow. Armored columns would then race up the corridor, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and the war's geography would be broken open. The operation was the largest airborne assault in history to that point. It launched on September 17, 1944, and it was catastrophic, not because the concept was wrong, but because the ambition had overtaken the available intelligence. A British officer named Major Brian Urquhart had the photographs. Aerial reconnaissance taken days before the drop showed armored vehicles in the woods around Arnhem, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, resting and refitting in the exact drop zone. Urquhart brought the evidence to his superiors. According to Cornelius Ryan's research, drawn from primary interviews, he was removed from duty and sent on medical leave. The operation proceeded as planned. The British 1st Airborne Division was dropped 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge, a decision made to avoid anti-aircraft guns over the city. 8 miles gave the SS Panzer Divisions time to regroup. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost reached the northern end of the bridge with approximately 740 men and held it for 4 days. The relief column never reached him. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission recorded approximately 1,984 Allied soldiers killed at Arnhem. 6,854 were captured. Total casualties across all Market Garden objectives reached approximately 17,000. Frost held the bridge for 4 days. The tanks never came. Montgomery later described the operation as 90% successful. The Rhine was not crossed until March of 1945. The war in Europe ended in May. What Market Garden exposed was not a failure of soldiers. It was a failure of a system that did not yet know how to weigh inconvenient intelligence against a commander's preferred plan. There was no institutional mechanism to force that reckoning. The evidence existed. The structure to act on it did not. Before systems existed, precision had to be engineered manually, and in May of 1943, 1 engineer and 1 squadron proved what that could look like at 60 feet above the ground in darkness over defended Germany. Barnes Wallace was not a military officer. He was an engineer at Vickers who had spent months calculating whether a spinning cylindrical bomb dropped at precisely 60 feet of altitude and precisely 232 miles per hour from precisely 425 yards could skip across a reservoir, roll down a dam face, and detonate at depth. The mathematics worked. The physical execution, most experts argued, was impossible under combat conditions at night. No. 617 Squadron trained for 2 months over British reservoirs without being told what they were actually practicing for. Wing Commander Guy Gibson led 19 Avro Lancaster bombers into the Ruhr Valley on the night of May 16, 1943, at 60 feet above the ground in darkness, over defended German territory. The Mona Dam was breached, the Eder Dam was breached. The release of approximately 330 million tons of water from the Mona alone destroyed power stations and industrial infrastructure across Germany's most productive manufacturing corridor, according to RAF Bomber Command's operational records. Gibson stayed over the target after his own attack run, flying circuits to draw anti-aircraft fire away from the crews still approaching. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. He was killed in a separate operation the following year. 8 of the 19 aircraft were lost. 53 of 133 aircrew were killed, per the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The floods that followed killed approximately 1,600 people in the valley below, the majority Ukrainian and Soviet forced laborers held in camps along the river. That detail is absent from most popular accounts of the raid. The strategic debate over how much lasting damage the Dam Busters raid inflicted on German war production remains unresolved among historians. Industrial recovery came faster than Allied planners expected. What the operation proved, without ambiguity, was something the following decades would try to institutionalize: that a technically impossible delivery could be achieved by a purpose-built unit with enough rehearsal time and precise enough mission design. The lesson was about specificity. It would take decades to build a system capable of applying it consistently. By the early 1970s, the militaries of Western nations had learned to execute. Rehearsal, compartmentalization, mission-specific training. The operational architecture of special forces had matured. What had not yet been solved was the intelligence problem. The gap between what a force could do and what it actually knew about its target remained dangerous, and no amount of training could close it. Son Tay is the clearest demonstration of that gap on record. Colonel Arthur Simon spent 6 months preparing his force of 56 Special Forces operators for a raid on a prisoner of war camp 23 miles west of Hanoi. A full-scale replica of the Son Tay compound was constructed for rehearsals. The assault force trained until the movements were automatic. On November 21, 1970, supported by over 100 aircraft, they executed the raid with close to textbook precision. One helicopter landed in the wrong compound, an adjacent military school housing approximately 100 armed personnel, believed to be Soviet or Chinese advisors. The 14 operators aboard neutralized it and reboarded without a single American combat death. The camp they had trained 6 months to assault was empty. U.S. intelligence had missed a prisoner transfer that had taken place 4 months earlier, in July of 1970. Flooding near the camp had forced North Vietnam to move its POWs to other facilities. Declassified NSA and CIA documents confirmed the gap. No one inside the American system had detected it. Son Tay produced an outcome its planners hadn't intended. North Vietnam, unsettled by the demonstration that American forces could reach the outskirts of Hanoi without being stopped, consolidated its POW population into larger camps closer to the capital. Conditions for American prisoners improved. Senior POWs credited the raid with keeping some of them alive. The execution had been nearly perfect. The intelligence had been 4 months out of date, and there was still no system in place to guarantee those two things would ever be aligned in the same operation. That alignment, for the first time, happened at Entebbe. Air France Flight 139 was hijacked on June 27, 1976, diverted by members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and German revolutionary cells to Entebbe International Airport in Uganda, 4,000 kilometers from Israel. Idi Amin's government cooperated with the hijackers. Of the 248 passengers and crew initially aboard, non-Israeli and non-Jewish passengers were released over several days. 105 hostages remained, along with 12 Air France crew who refused to leave. The deadline was July 4th. The Israeli military had 1 week. What followed was not simply a well-executed raid, it was the first modern hostage rescue that integrated real-time intelligence, purpose-built deception, rehearsed assault teams, and a command structure capable of making decisions faster than the situation could deteriorate. C-130 Hercules transports flew low over the Red Sea and Indian Ocean to avoid radar. A black Mercedes, the same model Idi Amin used, was driven off the lead aircraft at Entebbe in darkness. Ugandan guards expecting the president's convoy hesitated. The assault lasted approximately 90 minutes. 102 of the 105 hostages were rescued. 3 were killed, 1 in the firefight, 2 transferred earlier to a Ugandan hospital and killed there. 1 Israeli soldier died. Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, Sayeret Matkal's ground force commander, shot during the withdrawal. Before departing, Israeli forces destroyed 11 Soviet-supplied MiG fighters on the ground, Uganda's operational air force, to prevent pursuit. That was not in the original plan. IDF Chief of Staff Mordecai Gur called it one of the boldest operations in the history of the State of Israel. Military academies across the Western world spent the following decade studying Entebbe, not just the assault, but the command architecture that made the assault possible. For the first time, intelligence, planning, and execution had functioned as a unified system under time pressure. The operation became the reference point for every hostage rescue doctrine that followed. The United States military studied it too. What they had not yet built was an equivalent system of their own. At this point, the pattern should be visible. But in April of 1980, 6 years after Entebbe set the standard, the United States attempted its own hostage rescue. And the absence of a unified command structure made itself known in the Iranian desert before a single shot was fired. 8 helicopters left the USS Nimitz on the night of April 24, 1980. The minimum required for the next phase of Operation Eagle Claw was 6. Delta Force, the unit Colonel Charlie Beckwith had spent years fighting the Army to create, was making its first major combat deployment. The objective? 52 American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, 144 days into their captivity. The plan required the helicopters to reach a desert staging area called Desert 1, refuel from C-130 tankers, and proceed toward Tehran in the following night's darkness. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps components were operating together as a unified force. It was, in several respects, the first time they had ever done so. Not once had they trained together under realistic joint conditions before the night of the mission itself. One helicopter turned back after a rotor blade warning activated, later found to be a false alarm. One was abandoned in a sandstorm. A third arrived at Desert 1 with a hydraulic failure. 5 helicopters remained. Beckwith aborted. During the repositioning for abort, an RH-53D moving on the ground collided with a C-130 tanker. The fire killed 8 American servicemen, 5 Air Force, 3 Marine Corps. 4 more were wounded. 5 helicopters and a set of classified mission documents were left at Desert 1. Iranian forces recovered everything. The Holloway Commission found inadequate joint planning, poor inter-service coordination, and insufficient time for realistic crew training. It was, point by point, a documentation of what Entebbe had solved and Eagle Claw had not. The 52 hostages were released on January 20, 1981, 444 days into their captivity, minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Eagle Claw's most consequential product was institutional. The failure drove the creation of Joint Special Operations Command, established in 1980 to build the command architecture the United States had not possessed on the night of the mission. The gap that had killed 8 men in the Iranian desert would not be allowed to persist in the same form. JSOC represented the American military's answer to the question Entebbe had posed. It took a disaster to build the structure that should have existed before the mission was designed. By October of 1993, the architecture was in place. JSOC existed. Delta Force had been operating for over a decade. The Rangers and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment had trained together extensively. The lessons of Eagle Claw had been absorbed into institutional design. The American Special Operations System was, by any measure, the most capable it had ever been. Mogadishu exposed the limit of what that system could control. The plan was a daylight raid to capture 2 lieutenants of the Somali warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. 160 operators launched into the city on October 3rd. Estimated duration, roughly 1 hour. 2 MH-60 Black Hawks, Super 6-1 and Super 6-4, were shot down by RPG fire over the city. A third was severely damaged. The effort to reach the crash sites and hold ground under sustained fire through the night extended the operation into a 15-hour siege. 18 U.S. soldiers were killed. 73 were wounded. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant was captured and held for 11 days. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randall Shugart were told twice that no rescue force was available to reach Super 6-4's crash site. They requested permission to insert anyway. On the third request, they were given the go. Both were killed defending the site. Both were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first awarded since Vietnam, according to U.S. Army records. The targets were captured. The U.S. military considered the mission a tactical success. President Clinton withdrew American forces from Somalia by March of 1994. Osama bin Laden later cited the withdrawal as evidence that the United States would retreat under sustained casualties, a documented claim in the 2004 9/11 Commission report. The tactical success and the strategic consequence existed in complete opposition to each other, and the distance between them shaped the decisions of the following decade. Mogadishu was not a failure of preparation in the way Market Garden was. The intelligence was not ignored. The command structure existed. The training was real. What it revealed was something 40 years of institutional reform had not been designed to solve: that a technically successful special operation could produce strategic consequences no planner had modeled and no command structure could contain. We cover operations like this every week, the ones that changed how countries fight and the ones that showed exactly how they fail. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. 6 operations, 5 decades, a system that rebuilt itself after every failure and was tested again by the next one. Market Garden failed because the evidence was buried. Son Tay executed perfectly against intelligence that was 4 months old. Eagle Claw collapsed before it reached its target because the institutions required to run it hadn't been built yet. Entebbe showed what was possible when they were. Mogadishu showed that even a mature system operates inside a political reality it cannot fully anticipate. Courage was never the question. The variable was whether the system behind the soldiers was ready for what it didn't know was coming. Most of the time it wasn't, and when it wasn't, people died.